Montana Territory. October 1879, rain hammered the high plains like it meant to wash the world clean. The wind howled around the lonely homestead west of Fort Benton, and the door shook on its hinges when she knocked. Roland Latham swung it open, rifle in hand. His shirt was half-buttoned, damp at the collar. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his boots tracked dirt across the wood floor. He had not expected company, especially not a woman, soaked to the skin, clutching a little girl tight to her side. "I just need shelter for one night," the woman said, voice trembling but steady enough to be heard over the storm. "Please." Roland lowered the rifle, eyes scanning the horizon behind her. No wagon, no horse near the hitching post. Just the woman, the child, and a storm that would not quit. He stepped aside. "Come in." She hesitated for half a breath, then ushered the child through the doorway before following. The girl, no older than 4, clutched a small cloth bundle and looked up at him with wide brown eyes. The woman turned to face him. "Thank you, mister. My name is Zadie Thorne." "This is my daughter, Polly." Roland nodded once. "Roland Latham." He looked to Polly, then back to Zadie. "You both dry." Zadie shook her head. Her shawl was soaked through and her dress clung to her legs like wet paper. Polly had fared no better. He moved to the hearth. "Fire's warm." He tossed 2 more logs on the flames. "You can dry out while I find something dry for the little one." Zadie knelt beside the girl, rubbing her arms with quick, worried hands. Polly did not cry, but she pressed close, burying her face in her mother's skirt. Roland returned with a wool blanket and a faded shirt that might pass for a dress. "She can wear this. Best I got." Zadie took them. "Thank you." "I'll turn around," he said, stepping back. "You can change her here." She hesitated. "We'll be quick." While they changed, Roland busied himself with the kettle and a tin of dried beans. He moved without a word, but his eyes kept drifting to the woman at his hearth. Zadie's voice broke the silence. "I did not mean to come this far. I was headed to Helena, but the wagon caught a rut outside of Deer Creek. The man driving it left us behind." Roland turned. "He abandoned you," she nodded. "Said he would come back. That was 2 days ago." His jaw tightened. "You walked from Deer Creek with a child." Zadie pulled Polly into her lap, holding her close. "We had no choice." Roland stirred the beans harder than he meant to. "You are lucky you found this place. Not much out here. I saw the smoke." She glanced toward the window where the wind rattled the panes. "I did not plan to stay, just needed a place out of the rain." He ladled the beans into 3 tin bowls and handed one to her, one to Polly. The girl took it with both hands, eyes bright with hunger. Zadie looked down at the food, then at him. "We will work for it. I do not want charity." "I do not offer charity," he said, sitting across from her. "But I do not let children sleep out in a storm, either." They ate by firelight, the only sound the scraping of spoons and the wind outside. Afterward, Roland laid out a bedroll by the fire. "You and Polly take the bed." "I will sleep here." Zadie opened her mouth to argue, but something in his face made her stop. She nodded instead. "Thank you." He gave her a short nod back, then turned to tend the fire. That night, long after Zadie and Polly had fallen asleep in the bed, Roland sat by the hearth, watching the flames flicker low. He should have been thinking about the storm or the fence that needed mending or the cattle in the south pasture. But all he could picture was the way Zadie had hunched over her daughter, shielding her from the wind like she would take the sky itself if she had to. She had not asked for much, just one night. But something in him, something he thought had gone quiet years ago, stirred. He had buried a wife 5 winters back, no children, no one left to call kin. Since then, his days had been quiet, his nights quieter, just the land, the sky, and the cattle. He had made peace with silence until the knock on his door. The next morning broke clear and cold. Roland was already outside, chopping wood when Zadie stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in his old shawl. Her hair hung loose over her shoulders, still damp. "You rise early," she said. He paused, axe in hand. "Work does not stop." She smiled faintly. "I can help." He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time he saw more than just a woman trying to survive. He saw strength in the set of her jaw, in the way she carried herself, even after days on foot and a night in a stranger's home. "You any good with a bucket?" he asked. She lifted a brow. "I can carry water." He nodded toward the well. "Then you can help." By mid-morning, Polly was chasing chickens around the yard, laughing. Zadie scrubbed the floor while Roland pitched hay. She moved like she had done this kind of work before, fast and without complaint. When they stopped to eat, she sat across from him again, her eyes clearer than they had been the night before. "I do not have anywhere left to go," she said quietly. "My husband died last spring. We lost everything in Texas. I thought Montana would be a fresh start, but—" She did not need to finish. He understood. "You could stay," he said. She looked up. "For more than one night," he nodded slowly. "I have room, land, work. Polly would be safe here." "What would people say?" He met her eyes. "Let them say what they want." Zadie studied him, her gaze steady. "I will not be a burden." "You are not." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "I want you here." She blinked and her voice turned soft. "Why?" He leaned in, no hesitation. "Because when you knocked on my door, something in me woke up. I have not felt that in a long time." Zadie's eyes filled, but she did not look away. "I do not need saving, Roland." "I know," he said, "but maybe I do." That night she did not sleep in the bed alone. He stood at the doorway, unsure, until she reached out a hand and whispered, "Stay." He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her hand in his. She pulled him down beside her, and he wrapped his arms around her and Polly both. Zadie rested her head on his chest, heartbeat steady now. She had asked for one night of shelter. Roland had given her his name, his home, and his heart. And she had not run. The frost came early that year, curling its fingers along the fence posts and thickening the river just enough to slow its song. By the second week of November, the sun barely cleared the treetops before ducking back behind the mountains. Morning chores took longer with stiff fingers and stiff soil, but Roland didn't complain and neither did Zadie. They had fallen into rhythm. Not fast, not easy, but honest. Zadie stood at the washboard, sleeves rolled past her elbows, steam rising from the kettle beside her. Her hands were red from the cold water, but she scrubbed with steady strokes, her skirts pinned up to keep them out of the slush. Polly sat on a stool, threading corn husks into crooked dolls, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Roland came up from the barn with a splinter in his thumb, and the smell of hay clinging to his coat. "You got a minute?" he asked. Zadie didn't look up. "I got several." He shifted his weight. "There's an old smokehouse on the north side of the ridge. Been wanting to check if the roofs held through the wind. Could use a second pair of eyes." She rinsed a shirt and wrung it out over the basin. "Polly's not to be left alone." Roland nodded. "I asked Mrs. Kittredge to watch her. She's already on her way." Zadie turned then, brows lifted. "You went to the Kittredges." "Walked over after sunrise. Figured you'd ask." Zadie studied him for a long moment, then motioned toward the drying line. "Let me hang these and I'll fetch my coat." The walk to the smokehouse was uphill and quiet. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air had that iron taste that said it wouldn't be long. Roland walked beside her, his gait easy despite the slope. "You said you'd done some traveling before Montana." "I did." "What was Oklahoma like?" She glanced sideways. "Dry, dust and cotton. I worked a boarding house there for a spell." He didn't press. Instead, he stepped ahead of her to clear a fallen branch from the path. The smokehouse stood half sunken into the ridge, timbers dark with age and roof half swallowed by moss. Zadie stepped inside first, the smell of old cedar and soil thick in the air. "Looks like the beams are sound," she said, running a hand along the frame. "But the shingles are loose." Roland climbed up to check. "You know your way around wood." "I know when something's likely to collapse over my head." He chuckled, then winced as he tugged a bent nail from the roofline. "How long were you married?" Zadie didn't answer right away. She wandered past the door, watching the tree line. 5 years. He was a cattleman, not much money, not much sense, but he was kind to Polly. Roland climbed down, brushing sawdust from his palms. "You miss him, some days, mostly for Polly's sake." "She asks about him less now." Her voice didn't crack, but it thinned at the edges. "I think she's learning not to expect things to last." Roland didn't speak for a while. When he did, his voice was low. "I buried a woman once, Clara. We were only married 4 years. Zadie turned toward him. "Fever took her before the doctor could get out from town. I kept her shawl for 2 winters after, couldn't bring myself to put it away." Zadie stepped closer, her breath white in the cold. "What made you finally let go?" "I didn't." He looked down at his boots. "Just stopped holding on so tight." Neither of them moved for a long while. The wind moved the pines like they were sighing. Zadie brushed a hand down her skirt. "We should head back before Polly starts asking after us." Roland nodded. "I'll come back up tomorrow and set the roof right." They walked back in silence, not heavy, just full. By the time they reached the yard, Mrs. Kittredge was already pulling her shawl tight, heading toward the road with Polly skipping behind her. "She's got a good laugh, Mrs. Kittredge said, patting Polly's head. "Not every child does." Zadie thanked her, lifting Polly into her arms. The girl tugged playfully at a stray curl on her mother's brow. "You were gone a long time." "We had to check the roof," Zadie said, kissing her forehead. "Did you behave?" "She made me a peach tart," Polly said with awe. Roland chuckled. "You didn't mention tarts, Mrs. Kittredge." The older woman waved a hand. "You feed a man's child, he don't complain about the rest." She gave Zadie a look that lingered. "You're doing right by each other." Zadie's mouth parted, but she didn't answer. Not until Mrs. Kittredge was well out of earshot. "She assumes a lot." Roland shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe she just sees what's plain." Zadie shifted Polly against her hip. "It's not simple." "I didn't say it was." Polly laid her head on Zadie's shoulder, eyes already drooping. Zadie looked down at her, then back at Roland. "When we came here, I thought I was just surviving again, but this place, it's different." Roland reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "So are you." Zadie didn't look away. "You offered more than a roof. I haven't forgotten that. I meant it." She nodded slowly. "I believe you do." That night, after the lamp was turned down low and Polly was asleep beneath a quilt stitched with stars, Zadie sat at the edge of the bed, brushing her hair in slow strokes. Roland stood at the window, watching the frost gather on the glass. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. He didn't turn. "All the time. If I stayed," she began. "You already have," he said. She set the brush down. "Then I want to do it proper." He turned to her, heart thudding steady. "What do you mean?" "I mean I don't want to just be the woman who arrived in a storm and never left." Roland crossed the room in 2 strides. "Are you asking me?" She met his eyes. "I'm saying if you still want to give me your name, I'd take it, not out of need, but because I want to." His hand found hers, warm and calloused. "I want to build something with you, Zadie. Not just raise fences and haul water. I want to wake beside you when we're gray-haired and half-blind." She smiled, slow and sure. "Then let's do that." And that night, the wind outside softened. Inside, the warmth held. The ground had hardened under a thin crust of snow, brittle and dry like old bone. Zadie held Polly's mittened hand as they walked the 1/4 mile to the Kittredges' cabin. a basket of late apples swinging from Zadie's other arm. The child skipped beside her, bundled in a patched coat Mrs. Kittredge had let out to fit her. "You think Mrs. Kittredge will let me feed the goat again?" Polly asked, breath puffing clouds into the air. "If you ask kindly," Zadie said, "and if you don't chase her this time." Polly giggled, then darted ahead toward the porch where the older woman already stood waiting, apron dusted with flour. Zadie handed off the basket, exchanged a few words about nightfall and supper, then turned back toward the homestead alone. It was the first time in weeks she'd walked back without Polly at her side. The air felt different, emptier, but not lonesome. Not anymore. She found Roland at the east fence line, hammer in hand, shoulders hunched beneath his coat as he adjusted a warped post. A string of crows shot across the sky above them, wings black against the thin blue. "Post giving you trouble?" she asked, approaching. He didn't look up. Frost pushed it out. Ground's turned harder than it ought to be for November. Zadie crouched beside the next post, testing the wood. "This one's soft at the base." "I saw." He paused, then added, "I was thinking of pulling the whole line inward come spring. Bring the pasture closer to the barn." She nodded. That'd save time in the thaw. Roland set the hammer down and leaned against the rail. "You always this good with land?" "No," she said, "but I watched my father fight it long enough to learn where not to." He watched her fingers trace the grain of the fallen post. "You talk about him less than you do your late husband." Zadie stood. He wasn't much for talking himself. He'd spit on a fire before warming anyone by it. A wind kicked up and they both turned slightly, coats rustling. Roland's voice softened. "You ever think about how you'd raise Polly different?" Zadie looked toward the hills. "I already am." They walked the fence line together, boots crunching frost, the silence between them easy. When they reached the far gate, Roland pulled it closed and latched it, then turned to her. "Reverend Hawk rides out every second Sunday," he said. Zadie blinked. "I know. He's due next week. I figured we could have him by for supper, maybe talk with him." She tilted her head. "You want to be married before winter sets in proper." "I want to be married while the ground's still soft enough to dig fence posts," he said, half smiling. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze moved to the slope of the land, the bare trees, the thin creek twisting through the bottom of the valley. "Polly doesn't have a middle name," she said finally. "I want her to take yours, same as me." Roland nodded. "Then she will." They turned back toward the house, and Zadie slipped her hand through the crook of his arm. He didn't speak, but she felt his breath deepen beside her. Inside, the fire had burned low. Zadie added kindling while Roland unhooked his coat. She looked around the room, the worn table, the stove, the quilt folded over the back of the chair, and saw not what it had been when she arrived, but what it had become since. "You think folks will come?" she asked. "For the wedding?" She nodded. "Some will," he said. "Some won't," he set a kettle on. "The ones that matter will be there." She watched the flames catch under the wood, her hands folded in her lap. "I'll sew my own dress. I've got a length of muslin I was saving for curtains." "You'll look fine in anything," he said. She looked up. "You haven't seen me in white." "I don't need to." That night, with Polly still at the Kittredges and the house quiet but not empty, Zadie sat beside Roland on the edge of the bed. She unpinned her braid and let her hair fall, then reached for his hand and laid it over her heart. "I never believed in second chances," she said. "But this doesn't feel like a second anything. It feels like the first time I've been seen clear." He leaned in, forehead resting against hers. "Then let's build the rest from that." And when they lay down together, it wasn't out of need or comfort or even warmth. It was choice, deliberate and steady like fence posts sunk deep into good ground. The morning of the wedding came clear and windless. with a pale sun rising behind the cottonwoods and a hush over the land like it was holding its breath. The Kittredges arrived first, bundled in thick shawls and carrying a jar of preserved plums. Reverend Hawk rode up not long after, his horse steaming from the ride, Bible tucked under one arm, his eyes crinkled with quiet warmth. Zadie stood in the lean-to, fastening the last row of buttons down the back of her muslin dress. Her hands shook, not from cold but from the stillness of it all. Polly sat on the stool beside her, brushing the hem of the skirt with small, careful fingers. "Do I call him Pa now?" Polly asked. Zadie looked down, her voice steady. "If that's what feels right to you." Polly nodded, then reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a sprig of dried wild mint. "For your hair," she said. Zadie took it and tucked it behind her ear, her smile slow to rise. Outside, Roland waited near the corral fence, wearing his second-best coat and the boots he'd polished with bear grease the night before. He had trimmed his beard close and combed his hair with more care than usual. He kept glancing toward the lean-to, not anxious, but watchful, like a man who had waited long enough and now wanted only to see it through. When Zadie stepped out with Polly at her side, everyone grew quiet. She carried no bouquet, wore no veil, but she walked like a woman who had planted herself deep in soil and decided she would never be moved again. Roland met her halfway. "You came," he said. "I was expected." He offered her his arm. She took it. Reverend Hawk cleared his throat and opened his Bible, but he didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked between the two of them and said, "This land has seen fire, wind, and sorrow, but today it sees something steadier. You two have already done the hard part, choosing each other when there was no obligation. What we do now is only making truth visible." The vows were simple. Roland promised to build a life not just with his hands but with his heart. Zadie promised to meet him there, every morning, even on the hard ones. They didn't speak long, but when it was done, and Reverend Hawk told them they were husband and wife, they didn't kiss in front of everyone. Roland just reached up and touched Zadie's cheek, and she leaned into his palm like it was the only place she'd ever belonged. Polly clapped once, then ran forward, wrapping her arms around both of them. They spent the rest of the day at the table, the fire warm, the chairs pulled close. Mrs. Kittredge had brought biscuits and a tin of jam. Reverend Hawk poured cider from a dented flask and toasted to quiet joys and ordinary days. Roland didn't say much, but he stayed close to Zadie's side, his arm brushing hers each time he passed her a plate or refilled her cup. When the guests left and Polly had fallen asleep in the crook of a quilted chair, Zadie and Roland sat out on the porch, the sky above them a deep velvet, stars thick as spilled salt. "You didn't say much," Zadie said. "I did," Roland said, "just not all out loud." She pulled her shawl tighter. "You ever think about what you want the next 30 years to look like?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I want to wake up with your hair on my pillow and Polly's chatter in the kitchen. I want to mend fences with someone waiting at the end of the day. I want roots." She looked at him carefully. "You think you've got them now?" He turned to her, eyes steady. "I think I've had them since the night you knocked on my door." Zadie didn't answer right away. She just reached over and took his hand, twining her fingers through his. The wind had settled. The cold had softened. And in the quiet, beneath stars and wood smoke, the life they'd chosen stretched out before them, not easy but sure. They had asked the land for mercy, and it had given them each other. The last of the snow melted in April, soaking the fields and turning the far pasture into a slick mess of thawed earth and trampled grass. Zadie stood at the edge of it, skirts hitched above her boots, watching Roland and two hired hands guide a limping heifer toward the barn. The animal had taken a bad step on a patch of iced stone 2 weeks back, and though its leg wasn't broken, it had never fully steadied. "You going to keep her?" she asked when Roland came back up the slope, wiping his brow with a kerchief. She's stubborn, he said. But she eats, stands, and follows. That's more than I can say for some. Zadie folded her arms, her hands warm beneath the sleeves of her linen blouse. Sounds like someone I know. He raised a brow. That a compliment, that's how I meant it. He stepped closer, boots sinking a little in the soft ground. You've been quiet this week. I've been thinking. About. She turned toward the hills beyond the fence line. I'd like to start a garden, not just kitchen herbs, something honest. Beans, carrots, onions. You'd keep it near the house, behind the smokehouse. That spot gets good morning light. Roland studied her face. You think we'll need that much food this year? I think we'll need it next year, she said quietly. We'll have another mouth to feed. He stood still, not blinking. You sure? She nodded once. He reached for her hand, his voice low. You all right? I'm more than all right, she said. Just didn't want to speak on it until I was certain. Roland's fingers tightened gently around hers. You want the garden, you'll have it. I'll clear the ground this week. I can dig. I know you can, he said. He leaned forward, brushing his lips over her temple. But you won't have to. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm shifted again. Roland rose earlier, worked longer, and made sure Zadie never had to lift more than she chose to. Polly began setting the table without being asked, and sat beside Zadie near the fire most evenings, her fingers moving slow through a bit of embroidery she was learning stitch by stitch. One morning, Zadie found Roland fitting a cradle together in the barn, working from a sketch he'd drawn on the back of a ledger page. He didn't see her watching him, and she didn't interrupt. She just stood in the doorway, one hand resting low on her belly, and listened to the rasp of wood against wood. In June, Polly turned 5, and they made a cake sweetened with honey and topped with cream whipped stiff in a bowl set over snow they'd kept packed in the spring house. Roland carved a small wooden horse for her, and Zadie stitched her a dress from calico they'd bought in Fort Benton after the thaw. That night, after Polly had fallen asleep curled beneath the quilt Zadie had mended just the week before, Roland and Zadie sat on the porch, watching the stars break slowly across the sky. You ever think on how fast it changes? Roland asked. No, Zadie said. I think on how slow it took to get here, he nodded, quiet for a time. I don't miss what came before, but I'm grateful for what brought you to my door, even the storm, especially the storm. In the months that followed, the garden flourished. Zadie pressed seeds into tilled soil with Polly beside her, both of them in broad-brimmed hats Roland had stitched with cord to keep from blowing off. The beans climbed tall, the onions took root, and the carrots grew straight and sweet beneath the earth. By harvest, Zadie began moving slower, and Roland never let her walk far alone. He built a bench near the garden where she could rest, and Polly took to sitting beside her, asking more questions than Zadie could answer in a day. In early October, as the first leaves browned and curled against the wind, Zadie gave birth to their son in the back room of the house, with Mrs. Kittredge at her side and Roland just beyond the door, his face drawn tight until they placed the boy in his arms. He named the child Elijah. When Zadie woke after the worst of the pain had passed, she found Roland sitting beside the bed, the baby sleeping against his chest, his hand curled around one tiny, perfect foot. He's got your mouth, Roland said. Zadie smiled weakly. And your brow, he's loud. So were you, she said. That first night I knocked. They laughed, soft and tired, but whole through the winter the house held firm. The hearth stayed lit, the smokehouse full, and the cradle beside the bed never empty. Polly took to sitting close when Zadie rocked the baby, humming quiet songs she made up as she went. One night, as snow fell outside and the fire warmed the room in a low golden hush, Zadie sat beside Roland, Elijah asleep between them, and asked, "Do you feel settled?" Roland didn't answer right away. He looked around the room, the worn table, the cradle, the sleeping child, the woman who had changed everything without asking for anything more than a roof. "I feel home," he said. Zadie leaned against him, her eyes closing. "Then we've done something right." They had. The land had tested them, the past had marked them, but they had built something steady in the hollow between grief and grace. And when spring came again, they would plant more, grow more, and love harder. Because what they had wasn't a second chance. It was the right one.